This video is brought to you by Boxu and their brand new Sakura season box just in time for Hanami, but more on that in a bit. Hey everyone, Gaijin Goombah here and welcome to the very first episode of Witch Samurai. Now, much like our long-running sub-series Witch Ninja that looked at media's most popular shinobi, see which were good and which were bad, we're going to be doing the exact same thing here in this series, but with samurai, Japan's warrior class that ruled the country for almost 700 years. While ninja have been at the forefront of Western popular culture since 1967's James Bond hit You Only Live Twice, samurai have been somewhat in the back burner of popular media until the early 2000s. But since that time, there have been samurai after samurai that have become the narrative focal point of all manner of video games, TV shows, movies, comics, and so on.
Plus, as a pretty substantial benefit, unlike the history and culture of ninja, which is so esoteric and lacking in hard historical evidence that you could argue that they never really existed at all, samurai have all manner of written history and reliable sources. From their rise in the early 1000s to their eventual decline after the Boshin War and Satsuma Rebellion, Japan's people have done a really thorough job at keeping records of the evolution of their warrior class.
Now, people have been asking if we were ever going to do Witch Samurai for probably a couple years now, considering just how well received Witch Ninja was. But for the longest time, I always thought samurai were still too outside the zeitgeist when it came to Western understanding for enough interest to really be there. And then I heard about Elden Ring. Let me be blunt here. Has anyone not heard of this game yet? Because as soon as this FromSoft Souls game dropped, everyone and their mom was streaming it, myself included, for over 70 hours. And yes, I'll be showing a lot of boss fights in this game, so if you're afraid of non-contextual spoilers, you've been warned. But it's funny, I almost completely skipped over this game entirely until my friends showed me this one singular picture.
That easy to reel you in, huh?
Hey, I know who I am and I know what I love. And this was love at first sight, baby! I went full on samurai as my starting class and I did not look back. And this was apparently a very good thing to do because it turns out that the samurai class's stats, armor, and most importantly starting weapons were some of the best early to mid in the game. In fact, by being a predictable weebish samurai otaku, I accidentally into one of the best builds in the game. But while I was in the process of apparently cheesing every boss with Uchikatana's unsheath spam, I started to notice a lot of surprising things. I noticed that despite Elden Ring taking place in a world co-created by George R.R. Martin, no really, everything that I saw with the samurai class, a class that had no business being in this grimdark European fantasy, was not strangely familiar, but historically accurate. The weapons, the armor, the tactics, even the Ashes of War weapon arts, everything that this class uses are incredibly reminiscent of what made up true-to-life historical samurai.
Well, reminiscent, yes, but not 100% accurate. There's a handful of counterparts that I'm sure the internet would love to dogpile us on when it comes to our claim of accuracy, so for the sake of clarity, I'll be playing devil's advocate from time to time.
Alright, so, when it comes to which samurai are good and which samurai are bad, let's see where Elden Ring's Mononofu sits on the grand scale of history. Starting with the very first thing that you're gonna see in-game, your stats. Now, for anyone who's even vaguely familiar with RPG games, this is pretty standard stuff. Vigor, mind, endurance, strength, and dexterity are all stats that affect your physical capabilities, while intelligence, faith, and arcane are all stats that affect non-physical capabilities, like magic use and loot probability. So you'd think, okay, samurai are warriors, so of course they would have higher physical stats than mental or magical ones. It's obvious stuff. But here's the interesting thing. For warrior classes in RPGs, you'd think they'd have higher strength and constitution scores, right? Making them hit harder and have more hit points. But in this case, Elden Ring Samurai's highest stat is dexterity, typically a stat more useful for rogues and thieves. Kinda weird, right? So why is dexterity the samurai's highest stat? I mean, dex is actually pretty simple in this game. It determines what weapons you can use, reduces fall damage, and lets you cast spells a little bit faster, which you're not going to do. But dexterity also determines how hard it is for you to be knocked off your horse. And this teeny tiny little detail right here, this is actually one of the greatest examples of how Elden Ring samurai are historically true samurai. Because samurai, for hundreds of years, have been specialized mounted warriors who followed the combat protocol of not Bushido, but of Kyuba no Michi, the way of horse and bow. From the late 1100s to the 1800s, samurai warfare was not determined by the katana, but by the horse. And not only were horses the one utility of warfare that only samurai were permitted to use in battle, but throughout the drastic changes in military strategy and technology for nearly a millennium, the one consistency with samurai has always been the horse. Before, during, and somewhat after the Genpei War of 1180, horse-mounted archery was the way to fight for samurai. You can see it plain as day in every traditional work of art, visual or written, representing the time. On the battlefield, when samurai in this time period finally clashed in the steppe of Kyuba no Michi's combat called Kumiuchi, they and their on-foot retainers would constantly be on the lookout for other elite samurai. Easy enough to see as they were the only ones allowed on horseback. When met, they would exchange titles, names, and accomplishments, and then fight one-on-one with bows on their horses, then switch to polearms should ammo run dry or range combat become ineffectual. Should a samurai be knocked off their horse, retainers of samurai would run in to defend their lord. But a samurai knocked off their horse was at a grave disadvantage, as not only was their enemy now faster than them on horseback, but the samurai armor for the time, the oyoroi, was too boxy and bulky to make for flexible armor on foot. But it was great though for horse-mounted combat. Now like I said, samurai tactics changed a lot over time, especially after the Mongol invasions of Japan. At that time, samurai realized that the concept of Kyuba no Michi was outdated and desperately needed revamped, thus turning samurai from almost exclusively mounted archers to mounted shock troops wielding all manner of weapons both melee and ranged. But the exclusive right and use of the horse was still a core aspect to the identity of the samurai. Now let's look back at Elden Ring. Mounted combat is not only an option in this game, but in many cases, it's the superior strategy. But to be knocked off your horse not only leaves you on the ground for a long period of time, making you susceptible to hits while you're trying to recover, but now you're infinitely less mobile than your opponent. How do you fix this problem? Level up your dexterity, making it harder for you to get knocked off. Who has one of the highest default dex stats in the game? Samurai. It all comes full circle.
Alright, well let's transition over to the next thing you're probably gonna notice as an Elden Ring player, your starting gear. But more specifically, let's talk about the arguably most powerful ranged weapon any class starts with, the longbow. Not only does this weapon give you the option from the very beginning of picking off individual enemies from packs, making them far more manageable, but you can do some really dumb cheese with this weapon, like plinking away at elite fighters and even dragons at vast distances because, hey, what can they do about it?
No, it's true, I was able to pull off some really stupid crap with the longbow. The fact that you can easily farm and craft hundreds of arrows so quickly really did also help. Most other ranged abilities like magic require the use of the FP bar, which you don't have much of in the beginning of the game. But the bow? I could literally kill any non-boss enemy at range before it even came remotely close to me.
So let's talk about samurai and bows for a hot second. Cause while you spent all that time talking about Kyuba no Michi, you hammered on the ba, but not so much the Q. Again, despite our modern take on the samurai and the importance of the katana, it was the bow that was the weapon of the samurai class. In art and documentation, you see it not only in how the samurai fight, but also how they train. Samurai would use what was known as the Kisha Mitsumono, 3 training exercises to strengthen their use of the bow. Kasagake, riding around a course shooting targets with a bow, Yabusame, hitting targets while on a forward-moving horse, and Inu Omono, or dog chasing. Along with these 3, hunting was also a common practice with samurai to keep their bow skills sharp. Something you do in Elden Ring to a great degree when it comes to farming and crafting. And what really seals the deal with bows being far more important to the samurai than swords comes from an excerpt from the Konchaku Monogatari, or Tales of Times Now Past. Tachibana Norimitsu, former governor of the Dewa province, was being mugged while he only had his sword. But he was relieved in seeing that none of his muggers had bows on them either, only swords. Thus, he spoke about his relief and then quickly cut down the group. It's a small detail, but it does go to show what weapon had priority in the samurai's mind in the early 11th century. Then there was the great feat of Nasu no Yoichi in the Genpei War. At the Battle of Yashina in 1185, he and the rest of the Miyamoto clan's army were being goaded offshore by the Taira army's boats. The Taira lifted a fan onto a pole on one of their boats and taunted the Minamoto that they couldn't hit it. But Yoichi got on his horse, rode out in the water, and bullseyed the fan, completely demoralizing the Taira army. It was the actions of an archer, not a swordsman, that created such a legend of antiquity that reflected these times in Japan, yet again showing just how much more important the horse and bow was to the samurai. Therefore, it's no surprise whatsoever that Elden Ring samurai would start off with a longbow. But I will say this, because I know someone in the comments will if I don't. Though early warriors of Japan used symmetrical bows for quite some time, like you see in game and like other European bows, samurai opted into asymmetrical bows as early as the 3rd century, as having a much larger top half of the bow made for easier use when riding on horseback.
Alright, let's move on to the one thing that really makes this class, the Uchikatana. As far as I could tell, this is one of the best weapons in not only Elden Ring, but in any of the Souls games where it makes an appearance. It's fast, it has very few stat requirements, it has great reach, and finally it has passive bleed buildup. An effect that, once procced, causes the enemy to lose a huge chunk of health. Though, not exactly the best weapon to use on horseback, as it's still pretty short for range. Which I find kinda ironic because while samurai would use tachi swords that had longer blades, which made melee combat on horseback easier, it was the on-foot retainers and ashigaru that would use uchikatana. But anyway, I don't have to sit here and tell you how the uchikatana, aka the katana, became an important symbol of the samurai. It's the uchikatana's game weapon art Unsheath that we really gotta talk about here. Unsheath is one of the most brutal early game abilities. You sheath the blade and hold it until you either use light attack, which makes a cleaving arc, or heavy attack, which brings down an overhead vertical strike. Not only does this stack bleed build up, not only does it do insane poise damage, allowing you to score an extra critical hit, but you move forward as you swing, giving you extra reach in one quick attack. But something that I discovered as I used it is that you can't spam it mindlessly. There's a wind up and wind down to the ability that at first might make it seem worthless, but when applied as a punishing move, that's when this ability crushes. After upgrading the Moonveil Katana, which has the same weapon art jutsu with an extended range, every encounter I fought went the same. Read the enemy's movement, figure out when and where they're going to move, how they're going to attack, and then when you see an opening, drop that Unsheath. Don't sit there and try to get big swings in or a lot of little swings. Hit once and refocus, rinse and repeat. This strategy also worked really well in early PvP encounters, as it was impossible for the enemy player to tell whether you were going to use the overhead strong attack or the side slashing cleave, making the decision of where to dodge roll really difficult. I did this for nearly every fight in this game and it never failed me, but I started to wonder. I know for a fact that in Japanese the Unsheath ability is literally called Iai, as in Iai-do or Iai Jutsu. So how does the samurai martial philosophy of Iai Jutsu compare to how I've used it in-game thus far? Is Unsheath's optimal strategy in-game mirrored to that of samurai techniques of old? Well, to answer that question, let's have a look at what exactly Iai Jutsu is. Just after the Sengoku Jidai Warring States era came to a close, Hayashizaki Jinsuke Minamoto no Shigenobu, heck of a name right there, was said to have been visited by Kuma no Myojin in a dream after performing the 100-day prayer of Yakinichi no Sando. It was here that Kuma no taught Hayashizaki the secrets of sword draw striking that made up the backbone of what we now know as Iai Jutsu or Batto Jutsu. Iai Jutsu specialized in sword drawing, obviously, where a samurai would, in one motion, draw their blade from the saya and then use that movement in a single strike. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of you have seen the trope of the frozen samurai. Hand on the blade, either waiting for an enemy to wildly attack, or for said enemy to show an opening of weakness. Then, in the blink of an eye, the samurai sheaths their blade and the enemy falls limp. A pure romanticization of Iai Jutsu to be sure. But what's kind of interesting is that this romanticization is not too far from the intended purpose. See, back in the Edo period, samurai found a great deal of favor in Hayashizaki's Iai Jutsu style of fighting because field fighting and massive battles with heavily armed and armored samurai were now a thing of the past. These days, samurai were more of peacekeepers and thus would very rarely have to pull their katana out and fight. In fact, samurai that would draw their katana without hard evidence of the need to do so would be severely punished, sometimes even ordered to commit seppuku. Because of this, it was painfully important for a samurai to not only be able to strike an enemy down quickly, but they would also likely need to do so as they're being assailed by someone who has already pulled a weapon out while theirs are sheathed, putting them at a huge disadvantage. Iai Jutsu basically fixed all those problems. In one motion, a samurai could go from lawfully keeping their sword sheathed to having it in an attack in one motion. Not only was it a safe and legal way to strike, it was also incredibly hard to read. There was no real way to tell where the Iai Jutsu strike would land. Would it be an overhead slash? Underhand? Diagonal? Would it be a stab? It's just too unpredictable. This is the same unpredictability that frustrates PvP players in Elden Ring. Will it be that overhead attack or that side cleaving strike? Not only that, but I really do feel like the most optimal way to use the Unsheath art is incredibly similar to how it was historically used. Granted, this is the lands between and no one's gonna punish you for drawing your blade. Literally everything in this game is happy to kill you for simply existing. But what I mean is, the way that I use this ability in-game is not so unlike how Iaijutsu works in practice. In both instances, it's about outreacting your opponent. You wait, dodge, and act depending on the state of your opponent. And this doesn't mean that you just react to your opponent's movements. From what I've researched, in Iaijutsu, you can be the individual that makes the first physical move, but that move is predicated on the state of mind of your opponent. What do they do mentally? Maybe they drop their guard or even hesitated. After playing 70 hours of this game, I can tell you that that's the exact same way that I fought bosses. I waited to see what they were going to do or not do, looking for idle animations or moving out of big swings and then bringing down the unsheath. It's so hard to describe, but I kid you not when I say that the EI unsheath in-game mechanically works so similar to real Iaijutsu.
Quick note though, when it comes to Elden Ring's Ashes of War and the aforementioned action of seppuku, seppuku actually is in this game as an Ash of War ability, wherein you stab yourself in the gut, take just a little bit of damage, and then buff your katana with a bonus to both bleed buildup and raw damage. I don't think I need to say this, but this is not at all how seppuku worked. Seppuku was a lot of things in Japanese history. A way for a samurai to die honorably after defeat, starting back as far as the 12th century, a punishment to a samurai from their lord for wrongdoing, and even as an action of protest specifically called kanshibara, with a more well-known example being the seppuku of Hirate Masahide in 1553 in protest of young upstart Oda Nobunaga. In any case, it certainly wasn't a way to empower your fighting ferocity.
True, but there was a sort of poetic virtue when it came to a samurai's short life. Knowing that they could die at any time by war or by order of their superior for seppuku, samurai developed a lot of interesting philosophies on life and death, with one of my personal favorites being Hana wa sakuragi, hito wa bushi, literally meaning the ideal flower is the cherry blossom, the ideal man is the warrior. Later on, samurai would attribute their lives to sakura blossoms as both of their lives were very short-lived, but they were beautiful for the brief time that they had. Kind of ironic then that our very first Witch Samurai video would be sponsored by Boxu and their Sakura season box.
Well, I mean, Hanami is just right around the corner, if not happening right now at the time of the posting of this video, and though most folks, ourselves included, can't make the trip to experience it for ourselves, Boxu gives us a unique opportunity to dive into the spirit of the season.
With 16 different snacks themed around the celebration, I would think so. With specialized biteables coming from all over the country, from Akita to Fukuoka to even Okinawa. Though if I had to choose my personal favorites out of the 16, I'd have to go with the Kanagawa Sakura jelly made from pickled pink flowers soaked in ume plum vinegar, the omiyage favorite Sakura Chinsuko with its gingerbread flavor and sakura shape, and dude, what is Hanami without traditional Sakura mochi? And no, I don't have intimate knowledge of all these snacks, I just read them all up in the cultural booklet that comes in every box. For Sakura season, not only are you able to learn about each snack and its connection with Hanami, but this book is surprisingly crammed with information on the event. Everything from Japanese vocabulary to the history of Hanami and the importance of Sakura to Japan. So if you want to get your mind and mouth culture shocked with one of Japan's most well-known and well-celebrated seasonal pastimes, hit up that link in the description and use the code GAIJIN15 to get $15 off your order. Yep, Boxu is upgrading the discount for this limited edition box. So if you've been on the fence to try, now might be the time to jump in.
So come take a literal bite out of Japan's culture with Boxu.
Alright, let's talk about the last piece of starting gear that the samurai class has. The Red Thorn Round Shield. The one thing that on the surface looks horribly out of place compared to everything else. But what if I told you that this was completely on par historically? I mean, okay, sure the design of it is definitely more European than Asian, but the concept of samurai using shields, that's as historically accurate as it comes.
Well, that statement needs a bit of an addendum. Most samurai proper really didn't use shields because they physically couldn't. Remember, samurai were predominantly mounted archers for a few hundred years, and even with the invasion of the Mongols, samurai still predominantly would be on their horses, making it nearly impossible to provide a free hand to even hold a buckler. If samurai were going to use anything for cover, it would be the massive sode spalders that they could torso twist into to block enemy fire. But even that had its limits.
But that isn't to say that samurai and other warriors never use shields at all, ever. Samurai and Ashigaru alike absolutely use both the Tate body shield and Terate hand shield, with Terate shields in particular having similar size, shape, and capability of the Red Thorn Round Shield. Bottom line, from before the Heian period all the way to the Sengoku Jidai, shields were absolutely used. It wasn't until the advent of the firearm that shields finally became obsolete. In fact, you want to know something really interesting? I can actually tell from the armor of Elden Ring samurai that they weren't a purely mounted archer. Samurai in those times used the aforementioned Oyoroi armor that was super boxy looking. But in game, the Land of Reed's armor is the spitting image of the Haramaki-style Domaru armor, with its more rounded plates of iron and lacquered leather. This was a necessary shift in design after the Mongols invaded and samurai found themselves needing to have more flexibility for ground combat. Thus, it makes even more sense for Elden Ring samurai to start off with a terate-styled shield.
Alright, we're starting to hit the threshold of how much time we have in a video to talk about stuff, or else we're gonna get bogged down in development hell. So how about we just rapid fire some of the last samurai isms in Elden Ring that we got on the list?
Sounds good to me. We'll make it the quick cut round.
Alright, the cross naginata.
Oh, absolutely, samurai. You kidding me? Structurally speaking, it's exactly what the in-game description says it is. A katana blade on the end of a long pole that allowed for both slashing and stabbing attacks. Though I've not really seen a lot of naginata with cross blades like that. That's more of a Yari Spears thing with its multitude of blade sizes and shapes. But naginata proper? Bro, these things have been used by the warrior class since 1146. Specifically, it was written in the Honcho Seiki that Samurai Minamoto no Tsunemitsu specifically used the naginata, and he was far from alone. During the entirety of the Genpei War, naginata were regarded as incredibly strong weapons and thus had a huge amount of prestige. For ground troops, the length at which warriors could strike was a huge advantage, and the weapon was also very good at dismounting horse-riding samurai. So much so that the prevalence of the naginata forced samurai armor to evolve into including extra protection for the legs. As time went on, the naginata saw popularity rise from samurai to other military organizations like the Sohei warrior Buddhist monks, eventually becoming a symbol of strength and ferocity for women. Back in the times between the 11 and 1200s, wives of samurai were not simple housekeepers. They were well educated and well versed in combat. These were the Onabugeisha, and many of them were just as feared, if not more feared, than any other samurai in history. Looking at you, Tomoe Gosen.
Buddy, you said quick cut info.
Sorry. Short answer, yes. Samurai far and wide used naginata for generations until the Warring States era, when they were largely replaced with the easier to use, easier to craft Yari straight spear.
Thank you. Okay, next up, the Nagakiba, aka the Long Fang.
You know, curious that. In-game, it's a weapon that, quote, is reminiscent of a reinforced spear, which on first glance may mean it's supposed to be a nagamaki, a weapon whose handle is nearly as long as its blade. But really, based on the weapon's design, this is a nodachi, which despite how large and menacing this weapon looks, it didn't really get used all that much in combat. Its primary use was being an offering at Shinto shrines, but martial use? Well, for one, if it was used for fighting, it was likely just carried around unsheathed. I mean, trying to get that monster in or out of its saya was tricky enough without a page or some other third-party help. But truth be told, Fumon Tanaka was able to develop a drawing and sheathing technique for the nodachi called the Kolden in Shinryu. You just had to pull the sheath from the blade rather than the other way around. So, sure, I guess a samurai could technically carry it around like we see in game, though I do have to say, this weapon and technique focuses greatly on overhead attacks, whereas the Nagakiba swings in the same way as a katana. It's a video game though, so whatever.
Alright, the Meteoric Ore Blade?
You know, you'd think this katana would be all fantasy, being a meteor-encrusted blade that had bizarre gravitational powers. But I kid you not, there are katana that are made out of meteorite material. One such example being the Tentetsu To, or Sword of Heaven, on display in the Chiba Institute of Technology. A beautiful blade forged from the 4 billion year old Gibeon iron meteorite that hit Japan long before samurai were ever a thing.
And last ones, the Rivers of Blood and Eleanor's Polearm.
Well, right off the bat, I have to say that Eleanor's polearm is built from the idea around the dual naginata, or gyaku naginata. And as for as cool of a weapon as it might have been, it's purely modern day fiction. But Rivers of Blood, on the other hand, while it's completely fictitious, its fiction gave rise to a massive legend that grew well within the samurai class. Rivers of Blood, and very likely Eleanor's polearm, are idealized from the legend of Muramasa, the rival of Masamune whose blades were supposedly cursed, constantly craving blood, compelling its wielder to seek out as much bloodshed as it could, even forcing its wielder to draw their own blood for the weapon's sake. And while this detail isn't one-to-one, within the weapon's information it's said that it's, quote, a cursed weapon that has felled countless men. And, quote, when Mog, the Lord of Blood, first felt Okina's sword, he had a proposal to offer Okina the life of a demon whose thirst would never go unsated. Yeah, that's the exact same cause and effect of every legend about Muramasa's blood-hungry blades. But like I said, as cool as this all sounds, it's all kabuki-inspired fiction. In reality, Muramasa was an entire sect of smiths in Ise, nowadays Mie Prefecture, whose blades were known for being incredibly sharp and well-made, thus making them incredibly popular for warriors in the area. The only reason they were ever considered cursed in the first place was because they were said to have brought about death and misery to Tokugawa Ieyasu. Supposedly, Muramasa blades were used to injure the man himself twice, was used to kill his son during seppuku, and was used to kill his father, wife, and grandfather, thus giving Muramasa blades a cursed reputation. But even all this is conjecture, as Tokugawa's residence of Mikawa was very close to Ise, so it's likely that it was just random chance that Muramasa blades were used against the Tokugawa. Heck, Tokugawa used and passed down not one, but 2 Muramasa blades to his family. As far as the other accusations go, they're information taken from documents from over a century after the events took place, so it's kinda hard not to be skeptical about just how much harm Muramasa's blades really did to Tokugawa. So, that enough evidence for you that Elden Ring samurai are on the up and up historically? Dude, they even worked in a lot of samurai legends that I just completely didn't expect.
In a fantasy European game, no less.
And really, that's what compelled me to finally start Witch Samurai. If I can find this much information with samurai in a game that isn't even supposed to take place in fantasy Japan, then surely there are more topical samurai out there worth digging into. But thanks for watching, everyone, and a big thank you to Bulksu for sponsoring this video. Again, if you want to take a bite out of Japan's tradition of Hanami, click that link in the description and use my code Gaijin15 to get $15 off your purchase. Otherwise, let me know in the comments what you think of this new little sub-series. Do you know of any special pop media samurai that we should look into? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to sub up, get notified, and check back in soon for our newest culture and gaming videos. But until next time, everyone, this is Gaijin Goombah, signing out.